Thank you very much, Senator Shelby. So today's hearing, of course, is about the CFPB. It would be understandable if Director Chopra is pleased that it's the last time he'll be here dealing with me on this committee. So let me express my concerns. The last time Director Chopra testified, I did raise concerns about the CFPB's overreach in pursuit of a politicized agenda. And unfortunately, this behavior is nothing new for the CFPB. And under Director Chopra, my concern is it is more out of control than it's ever been. So I am disappointed, but not terribly surprised to note yet again that the CFPB has continued this pattern of overreach. In our constitutional system of checks and balances, only Congress has the power to appropriate money. James Madison called this, and I quote, "the most complete and effectual weapon with which any constitution can arm the immediate representatives of the people," end quote. But the Dodd-Frank Act exempted the CFPB from appropriations. It empowers the CFPB to simply take funds from the Fed, which is itself also not subject to appropriation, thereby doubly insulating the CFPB from any congressional control. I acknowledge there are other financial regulators not on appropriations, and we can disagree about whether or not they also should be. But it's indisputable that Congress has precisely zero leverage over the CFPB. It's very hard for me to imagine that our founders intended an agency to have the power of the legislative branch and precisely zero accountability to the legislative branch. And in any case, clearly the CFPB is overreaching and doesn't seem to care about Congress's view. This is why the Fifth Circuit recently found the CFPB's funding structure is, in fact, unconstitutional. The court noted, and I quote, "The Bureau's perpetual insulation from Congress's appropriations power renders the Bureau no longer dependent and, as a result, no longer accountable to Congress and ultimately to the people," end quote. Well, what can we expect from an agency designed to be unaccountable to Congress, if not overreach? For example, under Director Chopra, the CFPB unilaterally decided that the Dodd-Frank's grant of authority to prevent unfair, deceptive, and abusive acts or practices, known as UDAP, now includes the controversial disparate impact liability. It announced this change by fiat, without rulemaking. It ignored not only the text of Dodd-Frank, but also the fact that Congress never contemplated that UDAP would encompass disparate impact. Congress took the UDAP language from the FTC Act. For nearly a century, the FTC never interpreted that language to include discrimination or disparate impact. Finally, the CFPB willfully ignored the fact that Congress overturned the CFPB's disparate impact guidance for auto lending in 2018. So it's extremely implausible to think that an agency that was dependent on Congress for appropriation would engage in activity so clearly contrary to Congress's intent. In addition, the CFPB has publicly targeted businesses for taking lawful actions, like its smear campaign against bank fees for overdraft services. By the way, this campaign will do nothing for consumers. It'll just cause banks to shift fees to less transparent means of recouping the costs of providing overdraft services. Now, this week, the CFPB has doubled down on its use of name-and-shame tactics with a new proposed rule. It would create a public database of enforcement orders, judgments, and settlements against non-bank financial institutions obtained by federal and state regulators and attorneys general, including under state consumer laws that are not applicable nationwide. Now, maintaining such a list may well make sense, but making it public is different and would create the false impression that the orders of the most activist states are the nationwide standard. What's more, the proposal would require a senior official of certain non-banks to attest to the CFPB that they're complying with these orders. That would effectively give the CFPB enforcement power over other agencies' orders for violations of state and federal laws. The CFPB has no jurisdiction to enforce this. And there's no limiting principle to stop the CFPB from extending this rule from non-banks to all financial institutions. These examples are just some of the symptoms of an agency that's out of control and knows that Congress can't do a thing about it. That's why I'm introducing legislation, along with Senator Hagerty, to place the CFPB on appropriations. The best way to make the CFPB accountable to Congress is through appropriations. Through its rulemaking, the CFPB can exercise legislative power, and it does. What's ambiguous about the first line in the first paragraph of the first article of the Constitution? It says, and I quote, "All legislative powers herein granted shall be vested in a Congress of the United States," end quote. At the very least, Congress should carry out the responsibility that the Constitution assigns to us and exercise control over agencies like the CFPB that exercise legislative power. That's not all our legislation will do. It will also replace the agency's single director with a 5-member bipartisan commission, like the SEC and the FDIC. This structure will ensure that the CFPB considers a diversity of voices when it forms policy. And it's not a new idea. Bipartisan legislation to convert the CFPB into a commission has been repeatedly introduced. These accountability measures will help make the agency more responsible, more balanced, and more measured, and Congress will have to accept the responsibility for what the CFPB does, as it should. What's more, if Congress does not put the CFPB on appropriations, the Supreme Court may very well do it for us. The court is expected to consider, and I think might very well uphold, the Fifth Circuit's decision that the CFPB's funding structure is in fact unconstitutional. If it does, I've no doubt Congress will act swiftly to provide the CFPB with appropriate funding. After all, Congress has plenty of experience at appropriations. But by acting now through legislation, Congress could ensure the smoothest possible transition. This is in the best interest not only of the CFPB and Congress, but also consumers and our economy. That's why I call on my colleagues, Democrats and Republicans, to join me in supporting this sensible reform. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.